Hey strangers, just a note at the top. We found a local on a very obscure car commercial pronouncing this town name a little differently, but it's been pretty universally called Delphos in the media for the past 50 years, so we're going to go with that for continuity. If that was you in the commercial, please forgive us. I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Now, we've been told that rural Kansas, it's the perfect setting for anyone who'd like to spend some time considering the vastness of the night sky. While we have not personally had that chance, it's easy to imagine the scene, a horizon that just seems to stretch on and on and on. We figure that if you've picked your spot just right, you'll be far enough away from any pesky city light, and we can imagine stretching out on the hood of a car, a nice big one, circa 1970 or so, and then just gazing up into a starscape that we've never been privy to in the city. Constellations? They'd be easy to spot. A comet? We might actually see one if it was on the celestial menu for the evening. We'd like to think that if something extraordinary was to appear overhead, we'd be in the perfect position to spot it. And we think that Delphos, Kansas, it might just be the perfect setting for such an excursion. It's a little town in the north-central part of the state. The 2020 census put the population at just over 300, and twice that back in 1971 when our story, we'll get to that in a minute, takes place. Now, according to Kansas, a Cyclopedia of State History, Delphos was established as a railroad town back in the 19th century. The town was once famous for two things: being the site of a terrible tornado that destroyed roughly half of the town, and hosting a yearly gathering of spiritualists who travel in each summer to camp on its grounds. We're not exactly sure how long that went on, but it is an interesting tidbit. Actually, if we're sharing fun facts, we should probably mention that Delphos was also the hometown of Grace Bedell, the 11-year-old who, and this is per the Kansas Preservation Alliance, famously wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln and told him to grow a beard. We are, at our core, an educational program. Moving on. We are concerned today not with beards or spiritualists or even tornadoes, but what might have been seen in that wide, dark sky over Delphos, Kansas, and what might have been seen back in early November of 1971 by a farming family who lived on its outskirts. 3 people, Darrell and Irma and their teenage son Ronald Johnson, all lived on the property along with their sheep and their hogs and their dog, Snowball. Ronald is sometimes described as being 15 and sometimes as 16. Honestly, it just depends on the news source. Based on the various reports that we've dug up, they weren't the sort of people that one might expect to pop up with wild tales of strange things spotted in the night sky. AKA pretty much exactly who we expect, at least on this podcast, to pop up with strange tales of things spotted in the night sky. So, it was Tuesday, November 2nd, 1971. According to the Hayes Daily News, Ronald, who went by Ron or Ronnie, was wrapping up his evening chores. For him, that included tending the sheep, with Snowball the dog along for company, and we suppose for sheep wrangling. When we check the historical data, it seems like the shift to daylight savings time had already occurred on Sunday, October 31st. So by 7 p.m. on the 2nd of November, it would have been full dark, an hour plus after sunset. And that's important, we think, because Ronnie had a full view of the night sky. And per the Hayes Daily News, that full view, well, it allowed him to spot something hovering low, not far from the tree line, at a distance that was described as between 50 and 75 feet. This thing, it was, quote, as bright as a welding torch and made a thrumming sort of noise. Ronnie compared it to a vibrating washing machine. Ronnie later told the Greater Oregon newspaper, quote, "When I tried to move, I couldn't. I figure it was some kind of force coming from the object that kept me from moving. Even my dog Snowball seemed stuck to the ground and was silent, not even barking." Finally, the object rose and zipped off, and Ronnie was able to move. So he ran inside to rouse his parents, who were waiting at the dinner table expecting him to join them. And instead, they found themselves rushing outside to see what had frightened their son. They were just in time to catch sight of something in the distance, and depending on the source, they variously described it as like a washtub or like a mushroom. They couldn't say precisely what they saw, but per High Plains Public Radio, it was huge, quote, "big as a full moon," and it was moving fast. And it had left evidence behind. As Irma Johnson would later recall to the Salina Journal, there was an eerie glow cast over the area. She said, "The whole yard was lit up where it had been, just like a fluorescent light bulb." According to the Kansas City Star, Ronnie estimated that the object, it might have been 10 feet high and 9 feet wide. And his parents, well, they never got close enough to estimate anything. But the whole family figured that Ronnie's experience might have lasted 3 to 5 minutes, but he couldn't be sure. This is, well, pretty standard, we know. We have likely described 10 such sightings to you over the last 5.5 years. But what the Johnsons found next, it was a little off the beaten UFO path. As the Hayes Daily Journal reported, they decided to venture out to where the craft had been hovering, near that tree line nearby. And there, they found a large, round mark, a quote, "phosphorescent ring in the dirt." Now, according to the Salpopa Daily Herald, the ring was found, quote, "near the family's hog house," which was probably not a great time for the hogs. And the paper noted that several tree limbs overhead, they were broken. And the trees in the vicinity seemed, well, wrong. They were, quote, "slightly discolored in a way that they had not been before." Per Dead History, the ring was completely dry, despite recent rains that had left the surrounding ground absolutely muddy. This spurred the family on to further inspection. And when Irma Johnson bent down and touched that dry earth, well, per Greater Oregon, quote, "Mrs. Johnson bent down to touch the gray-white substance which formed the circle. It felt like a slick crust," she discovered, as if the soil had been crystallized. Her fingertips went immediately numb. The paper wrote that, quote, "this condition, which she compared to the effect of local anesthetic, lasted for 2 weeks." Now, Mrs. Johnson complained that, as a nurse, she was unable to take patients' pulses. She simply could not detect them. Now, several years later, Irma told the Salina Journal that when she'd noticed her numb fingertips, she touched her head and then her leg, and those body parts, they became numb too. Her head eventually returned to normal, but her leg was still numb at the time of that article's publication in 1974. Her husband, he had a similar reaction, numbness, though he got feeling back in his hands much more quickly. As for Ronnie, well, Greater Oregon reported that he'd been temporarily blinded by all those bright lights, a feeling he described as welder's burns, and his eyes were, quote, "bloodshot and painful for days." The Johnsons made sure to take a photo of that bright, glowing ring, and then, left with a dry, mysterious, and apparently numb-inducing circle in the dirt near their hog house and a very frightened teenage son, the Johnsons did what pretty much anyone else in their small town would have. They phoned the local sheriff, Ralph Enlow, and the next day he arrived, with his deputies in tow. According to Greater Oregon, he measured and photographed what he described as a ring, quote, 8 feet in diameter, and he took soil samples, and according to the York Daily Record, noted the discrepancy in moisture. Enlow described the soil within the ring as being as, quote, "dry as if it had been sitting in the desert for 10 years. But that wasn't all. The York Daily Record mentioned something that we hadn't seen come up in the earliest articles. Quote, "a mysterious white substance that was contained inside the ring." That substance, strangers, and the odd properties of the dirt itself, they were enough to draw the attention of ufologists. And it wasn't too long before some of the leading experts in the field had descended on the tiny town. Delete Me makes it easy, quick, and safe to remove your personal data online at a time when surveillance and data breaches are common enough to make everyone vulnerable. I've said it before, signing up for Delete Me in 2021 was one of the best choices I've made for my family. My work on cold cases and being in the public eye makes me extra careful about reducing our personal information online, and Delete Me has given me real peace of mind. New data brokers pop up constantly. Delete Me monitors and removes my information from hundreds of websites and sends regular personalized privacy reports showing exactly what they found, where they found it, and what they removed. This is not a one-time service. Delete Me constantly monitors and removes the personal information you don't want on the internet, and I can track all the work being done on my behalf. Seriously, this is a service I recommend to all my friends and colleagues. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me, now at a special discount for our listeners. Get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/strange and use promo code STRANGE at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/strange and enter code STRANGE at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/strange, code STRANGE. Now, we've mentioned Dr. J. Allen Hynek a number of times before on this show. He's the guy who came up with the whole classification system for close encounters, of the first kind, of the second kind, etc. In 1971, he was a professor at Northwestern and was actively investigating UFO sightings, along with a number of other collaborators. And one of those researchers was a man named Ted Phillips of Missouri. He has also come up on the show before as one of the most serious and prolific UFO researchers in the nation. Per the UFO Chronicles, Ted became involved in the work in 1964 and met, quote, J. Allen Hynek during the investigation of the Socorro UFO landing. The site notes that, quote, Phillips was trained as an engineer and was a professional photographer. He was involved in the Vanguard satellite program and was a field engineer on the Minuteman missile project. He was also employed as an inspector for the Missouri State Highway Department. Perhaps it was that background that led Hynek to suggest that Ted Phillips focus on field research, specifically that he, quote, concentrate on UFO physical trace cases. And Ted Phillips did, thousands of them. Ted also considered himself a skeptic, which made him the ideal person to examine the physical evidence left after alleged UFO sightings. Anyway, according to the Salina Journal, he was the researcher who came to town, ready to inspect the ring and to speak with the Johnson family. He first visited in December, then returned for further study in January of 1972, and he'd eventually return again later, in June. When he came to town, he heard from locals who claimed that they'd seen the ring themselves, and described it as, quote, glowing for 4 days after the initial sighting. Ted Phillips himself observed that it was still clearly visible on the ground, and that the ring was dry. Per the journal, he set out to take samples and to conduct an experiment. Quote, Phillips planted seeds both in the soil where the UFO hit the ground and in the regular soil. The seed in the UFO soil did not sprout, whereas the seeds in the regular soil grew normally. We kind of expected to learn that nothing much happened after that. That generally is the way of things in the news archive, strangers. But no, something did occur. Ted Phillips also observed that after his first visit, the ring stayed visible for months. The Kansas City Star published extensive coverage, noting the affected soil was, quote, moisture resistant and would not allow absorption of the snow into it. The newspaper published photographs showing the ring remained distinct well into the following year. And that soil stayed weird too. Ted Phillips told the Star in June of 1972, quote, I've submerged this soil in water for 8 weeks, broken it open, and it was still dry in the center. And remember that white stuff that we mentioned earlier? The scientists studied it, but we couldn't really find an answer as to what it might have been. Researchers who analyzed Phillips' samples reported the soil had been laced with what the Kansas City Star described as, quote, an unidentified fibrous substance. And the Salina Journal would later describe it as, quote, a white, mossy substance in every pore of the soil, the nature of which has defied scientific investigation for more than a year. And note that the substance extended at least 16 inches below the surface. Darrell Johnson had his own term for it. I call it mildew. Whatever it was, it seemed to be particular to the ring. The mysteries on the Johnson farm, though, they did not stay contained to that 8-foot circle. We've already mentioned some of the physical effects experienced by the family, like Ronnie's bloodshot eyes and Irma and Darrell's numbness. Ronnie also noted that he experienced headaches, and some of Irma's symptoms persisted for years. Those were not all the physical manifestations noted on that night or later, though. According to the Salina Journal, the family said that on the night of the sighting, quote, the sheep, the hogs, and the pet dog Snowball were all paralyzed until the UFO left after the first visit. And months later, Snowball experienced another very strange situation. Per the journal, it was early 1972 when the dog showed signs of illness, what the paper described as, quote, bleeding from the head. When he was examined by a vet, the doctor discovered, quote, a weed-like 3/16-inch growth in its nostril. And then there was the livestock. The journal reported that the lambs gave birth earlier than they should have, basically before they were old enough to do so, the very next spring. The hogs, they had fewer litters than usual. And then there were the effects that were harder to classify, like Mr. Johnson's trouble with his wristwatches. According to the Salina Journal, quote, since the first sighting, Johnson said, he's been unable to wear a wristwatch for more than 2 days. After some experimentation, he finally began alternating watches so they'd last longer than 48 hours. Personally, we would have given up on time altogether, but we admire his commitment. Maybe it all had something to do with the ring, maybe not. But it is probably worth mentioning that the circle in the Johnsons' yard did seem to have some effect on batteries. Because, as the journal noted, tests revealed that, quote, battery-operated radios quit playing altogether once they were placed inside the circle. Those were the immediate issues that the Johnson family faced. And then there were the problems with other people. We're lucky that the Salina Journal provided so much coverage on the events, and they revisited the Johnsons and the scientists, don't worry, we will get back to them, over the years. We told you that Delphos is a small town, and while the sheriff and Ted Phillips took the farming family's story seriously, things were different with some of their neighbors. A May 1973 Salina Journal article described the Johnsons as, quote, the laughing stock of Ottawa County. Irma said that locals regularly asked her if we've, quote, seen any more little green men. By October of 1974, Ronnie had quit attending the local high school, where he had been mercilessly teased. The family had received hundreds of letters from strangers, too. Per the journal, many were unfriendly, and some were even threatening. It seems that a number of people took issue with the fact that the family had won a very unusual prize in 1972, and one that was offered by the National Enquirer. According to the Kansas Reflector, they were awarded $5,000 by the tabloid as part of a larger promotion seeking hard evidence of alien life. Their portion, which would be worth around $38,000 today, was for the, quote, most valuable scientific evidence of an alien visitation. That is a lot of money for a farming family in a tiny town. But the death threats and the public scrutiny were not easy to face day to day. Ronnie told the Salina Journal that most of their harshest local critics had never even come to see the ring for themselves. As for Ted Phillips, the physical trace investigator, he told the Kansas City Star that he had, quote, no reason to doubt the validity of the sighting after his investigation. He didn't precisely say what the family saw. Ted was a man who seemed focused on concretes, but he was certainly interested in the ongoing scientific investigation of the after effects. And so were other scientists. Per the Associated Press, chemical analyses of the soil continued for years, decades even, after Ronnie's fateful sighting. And there is something else to consider. The Johnsons, they were not the only people having otherworldly experiences in Kansas in the early 1970s. According to the Sapulpa Daily Herald in nearby Dighton, Police Chief M.R. Shelton reported that an unidentified flying object had been, quote, seen several times in the area since January and, quote, apparently still has an interest in this section of Kansas. One witness, 17-year-old Pam Crable, described seeing, quote, a red-orange glowing object ahead of her on the road. As she told the paper, it didn't move like an airplane or anything. It just stayed there and hovered. Then it moved real fast and stopped. But it wasn't just sightings. The next morning, Pam's father, Orville Crable, quote, discovered a 20-foot circle in a field where all the plants were dead. There were no tire tracks leading to the site, and no explanation for the dead plants. The Springfield News Leader reported that this was part of a broader UFO revival happening nationwide. After years of declining interest, UFO investigators were suddenly overwhelmed. As one researcher told the paper, we're getting so many reports that I can't get them all in my paper. Eventually, the Kansas UFO fervor did die down, but the physical evidence from the Johnson farm remained of interest to serious researchers. In fact, the case continued to attract scientific attention for years after Phillips' initial investigation. As the Salina Journal reported in 1974, representatives from Hynek's office had visited the farm 4 or 5 times more to take samples and measurements. And according to the Associated Press, by 1989, the Journal of UFO Studies had published chemical analyses of the Delphos soil samples, a paper that's been revisited by the author at various points. It's not so much that the soil was something unknown to Earth. It wasn't. It's simply that it had behaved so strangely. The Johnsons said it took years and years for anything to grow in that area besides hard toadstools, and it just never looked quite right. Even decades later, at our time now, the scientific curiosity has persisted. According to Unilad, the TV show The Proof Is Out There sought out modern opinions on the soil samples. The show's team of analysts confirmed that the chemicals found in the soil are, quote, hydrophobic in nature, meaning that it is water repellent. More remarkably, physicist Matthew Shadagis confirmed to the show that, quote, despite the time that's passed, the soil is still displaying glowing properties. Which, we must say, is weird. But not everyone found that soil, or the experiences the family had, to be otherworldly. Way back in 1975, a skeptic named Philip J. Klass addressed the Delphos, Kansas case directly in the Tampa Bay Times. He dismissed it as part of what he called, quote, UFO mythology, and argued that, quote, basically honest and intelligent persons who were suddenly exposed to a brief, unexpected event, especially one that involves an unfamiliar object, may be grossly inaccurate in trying to describe precisely what they have seen. More recently, and this is again according to Unilad, NASA geologist Dr. Bob Anderson suggested that the incident was, basically, natural phenomena. He started with a symptom, Irma Johnson's numbness. Anderson explained, quote, the mother got her hand burnt a little bit by touching the ring. That usually happens if you have an acid, and it wouldn't surprise me if something got into the groundwater. My gut feeling is that there was something buried in that area. It was a man-made chemical, which would not show up on those 1970s soil surveys. Now, strangers, you know that we generally withhold judgment when it comes down to the unexplained. But for us, Anderson's explanation, well, it raises as many questions as it answers. A buried man-made chemical that somehow evaded detection for 50 years while continuing to prevent plant growth and to repel water? Okay, maybe. But one that the Johnsons failed to notice on their own land. And yet, still, you might say, all right, podcast, maybe they had noticed. But maybe they suddenly had a reason to notice that ring at that time. And maybe that reason was perhaps a prize offered by the National Enquirer, which would have been enough reason to encourage them, maybe even enough to arrange a hoax. And maybe that would be a very neat answer. It would be, except for one strange thing. As far as we have been able to discover, it was not until the spring of 1972 that the tabloid began advertising that money or that prize. The Johnson sighting occurred months earlier in the fall of 1971, and regarding the National Enquirer, well, they started with a much bigger prize of $50,000. Based on all the archival news that we have reviewed, the Johnsons got that smaller portion we noted earlier of $5,000 for the most convincing physical evidence presented. So, if that's all correct, the dates, the times, the creation of an unexpected and smaller prize, they'd have to be pretty darn prescient. Honestly, we don't think there's a very good earthly explanation for what happened to the Johnsons on their farm. As Ted Phillips put it to the Kansas Star back in 1985, it's kind of like the murder mystery that has no ending. I believe that something real is going on. I just don't know what. And we agree. We can't say what Ronnie saw that early November evening in 1971. But the physical evidence, it's compelling. And the Johnsons lived with the after effects longer than that money ever lasted. According to the Kansas City Star, in 1978, all 3 family members were still taking nerve pills regularly. Ronnie was, quote, haunted by the experience, and his father said he was continually hearing the same buzzing sound from the night and saying that, quote, the UFO was coming back. Irma's leg numbness, well, it was permanent. When doctors, quote, stuck needles in her thigh and drew blood, she felt nothing. The family eventually moved into Delphos proper. They kept their farmland, though, and we hope that ring stayed buried. But we're not really sure. Nearly 15 years after the original event, in 1985, Ronnie was still contemplating what he'd experienced. As he told the Kansas City Star then, "We can go up there. Why can't they come down here?" So I catch myself looking up in the air. We don't blame Ronnie for that. We'd spend a lifetime looking up and down at the earth, even if we'd covered the evidence to protect our peace or to forget, if we'd gone out one night to take care of the chores and been blinded by change we could not begin to fathom, and that scientists 50 years later were still trying to understand. And, like Ronnie, we figure that we'd still be waiting to see what came next, too. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers. From the lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. One Strange Thing is an independent podcast. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and enticingly peculiar, you can check out our premium offerings. If you'd like to subscribe on Apple Premium, you'll get both premium and ad-free and early access episodes, along with ad-free and early access to our other podcast, The Fall Line. If you subscribe on Patreon, you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, a monthly full-length bonus episode, giveaways, and blog posts. We hope you'll check out one of these options and support the show. There's a link in the show notes. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, please take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps.
Como mamá, siempre quiero lo mejor para mi familia. Por eso quiero lo mejor en mi cocina. Y eso significa solo huevos Eggland's Best. No importa cómo los cocines, siempre saben frescos y deliciosos. Y tienen más vitaminas D y E y el doble de omega 3 que los huevos regulares. Entonces, ¿por qué conformarte con menos cuando puedes tener lo mejor? Eggland's Best. Mejor sabor, mejor nutrición, mejores huevos.